What does the Bible say about the age of the universe and the earth? Absolutely nothing. So why fight about it, folks?
We reviewed this video with John Lennox, and this is my encouragement to everybody who comments, even all the haters. We read most of them. And now, in the video, which you'll see, John Lennox kind of, his main argument, his main point is just
the
like
scientific establishment has established a certain idea and we have tested it, and then so let's apply that to.
Well, and even, you know, I remember from when we recorded it, his main point and the thing that we latched onto was like, we look back on the arguments about whether the earth is spinning around the sun or the sun is spinning around the earth as totally, in those days, it may have seemed like a biblical argument, but we don't think of it as a biblical argument anymore. The difficulties of the text have kind of faded away. And his point, as I remember it, was kind of like, yeah, one day the difficulties that we think are in the text will kind of fade away. And, you know, and there are lots of good ways to view it as an old earth or a young earth. And the difficulties of the text will just fade away as science becomes more clear. And I remember the way that we took that was, yeah, he's got a point. You could take it either way. But in the comments, you know, we had a lot of people on one side who just said, you guys are a couple of idiots. I can't believe you don't believe the science. Evolution's obviously true, which were not always thoughtful or helpful. Much more thoughtful were people on the young earth side who came in and said, no, hey, listen, here's some biblical texts and some real biblical reasonings why you ought to take a young earth seriously. Like you can't play around with, yeah, maybe if you look at just Genesis 1 in his little microcosm, you can play around with just Genesis 1, but in the broader implications of believing in an old earth or in these other verses that you have to consider, no, the Bible clearly teaches a young earth. And what's so funny is that when we first recorded that video, I have always been staunchly, I believe to the hilt in a young earth. But you did not necessarily. And it was the comments that got you to think.
Well, so I approached that last conversation of just like, yeah, I don't know. And I don't think I can make a decision. So let's just talk about this. And then as I started looking into the comments, I started seeing that young earth arguments were actually pretty strong from a biblical standpoint. And
from within the text itself.
Yeah. And I would say I'm still approaching it with that same probably mindset of I don't think it matters a whole lot, like ultimately in the grand scheme of things. But I guess in this conversation, we'll kind of break down why it may actually matter more.
And I will whip out. I really do. I feel very strongly about.
Hey, I'm ready for you to just unload, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yep.
But do you just want to jump into it?
We're
running it back. We're running back the same clip that we ran before. So
go for it.
Let's do it.
Galileo, the first moving earther, and everybody else was a fixed earther. The philosophers, the Aristotelians, plus the Catholic Church. But then there were one or two more moving earthers as they began to be convinced. And now the whole lot of you are moving earthers. But you haven't necessarily given up your conviction that the Bible is true. Why? Because we can see that when the Bible speaks about the earth being fixed, it's not talking about being geometrically or spatially fixed. It's talking about something much deeper, and that is stability.
Okay, pause this. So I understand his argument on stability, but this was actually one of the things that got me thinking in the comments, and that I completely agree with now, which is in the theory of relativity, there is no center. It is all dependent on your reference point. So we mentioned in a conversation on Monday that you could take your reference point as, you know, the Milky Way galaxy, and then it's kind of all the one place. Or you could take your reference point as the earth, and then, theoretically, things are moving around the earth. And so that was a pretty profound comment on the video, because it's true. It all depends on your reference point. So which point are you determining as the center, or as what's rotating around the other?
And even not even from we think of the little marble in space, and the earth is not fixed, but totally from a standpoint of a human being who has never conceived of going out into space, Moses and Abraham and the writers of the Psalms, the earth, the land is fixed as I look out on the horizon. And so you go, well, duh, okay, the earth is fixed. Sure, of course the psalmist would write that. Yeah. That doesn't bother me at all.
And we're perfectly in the, the Goldilocks zone per se, to where we can have perfect, biology emerge through oxygen and heat and everything, all the conditions you need for
water.
Yeah, for life to flourish. And so that can be interpreted in multiple ways, but I think it's important to know, like, the psalmist is not trying to make a scientific claim with that. He's trying to make a spiritual claim of I think one of them is stability, but it's of that there's order, that God is a God of order.
But it is an open question if you can apply that same logic to Genesis 1. Is Genesis 1 just a theological or spiritual claim? I think that's a good question to ask, and it doesn't follow that the same answer necessarily, because the earth is fixed, that quote can be taken in a metaphorical or spiritual sense, does not necessarily follow that all of Genesis 1 should be taken simply metaphorically or spiritually.
And you can't do that to any particular text in the Bible. Like, when you do that, either one way or the other, everything's metaphorical, everything's literal, you get in weird theological positions. But I think what we'll see as we go on, that it's kind of, what are you taking as more authoritative? What authors, what people, what texts are you taking more authoritative? And because science changes all the time. So what the existing ideas change all the time. So let's continue.
And the Bible refers to this. He's made summer and harvest, they're fixed things, and they depend, the stability of the earth in its orbit, for example, depends on gas giants and inverse square law of gravity and everything else. And we're happy with that. But for centuries it was difficult. Now come with me if you can. It seems to me a very similar thing is happening with your question. You can believe, if you want, that the Bible says the earth doesn't move. You can believe it, but you don't have to. Now, I want to argue briefly that you can believe that the earth is young and the universe is young, but you don't have to, because the Bible doesn't claim it.
Tell me why James Tour is sitting there like totally young earther, like just like and
I'll tell you why.
I don't know if he is.
I will tell you why. No, I will tell you why. Because there's two main assumptions that an old earth hangs on. And one of them is evolution. You need massive timescales for evolution. And James Tour knows that that's a load of baloney. So I can't speak for James Tour. I would love to sit down with him. He's just a couple miles down the road.
You're saying it the wrong way, right? So it's actually the other way around, that evolution, young earth is needed for evolution.
No.
So evolution is hanging on whether young or old earth, rather than like the earth could be old and evolution not be a thing.
They work together. Yeah, but they work together.
Like
the earth could be old. The earth could be old, and there be no evolution. That's true. But if evolution is true, you need the earth to be old. If the earth is young, evolution is dead in the water. But I think that it seems to me, I do know that James Tour thinks that evolution is dead in the water anyway.
Totally.
So he doesn't care about an old Earth. He's willing to take the text at face value.
Yeah.
Because there's no dog in the fight to force the Earth to be old. Whereas for the sake of science or for the sake of evolution, many scientists will say, well, the Earth has to be old in order to fit in these timescales for evolution, where James Tour doesn't care.
And that's including like theistic evolution. So this is believers who believe in an old Earth.
Right.
And
If you are going to pick up
God
the
used-
narrative of the standard narrative of the fossil record, that
Right.
all the way down here is 800 million years ago, and then we work our way through the fossil record of gradual change over time until we get to Homo sapien.
Well, not even the fossil record. You're talking about the layers, but the fossil record doesn't even show in between species. Like the fossil record disagrees with that.
That's why I mean
So-
the standard narrative
Yeah.
of
That
the
some people
so-called-
take,
yeah.
they want to, a lot of people in college and things like that, where like maybe that was the way God did create man. Who's to say he couldn't use that? He uses other, forces of nature to bring things about, and he did, bring man from the dirt. So you could interpret that as, I'm just presenting that position.
Well, and one of the best comments that got left over and over and over again was, then what you're saying is, when God said, if you eat that fruit, you will die, was not when death was introduced. If the scripture teaches that
Right.
Adam introduced death to the world when he sinned, actually that's not true.
Yeah.
That death was there for millions and millions and millions of years.
I think that was the most convincing comment for me.
Really?
Yeah, because it does present a very legitimate theological problem
Mm-hmm.
of the legitimacy and accuracy of the text.
Mm-hmm.
The only way around it that I could think of, is if ancient dinosaurs were at the same time as man. But then it just you don't need that, because then man was created at the same time. So
This for me really is the most compelling one. Ready? It's in the 10 Commandments. So God is giving the 10 Commandments. You'll have no other God before me. No idols. Don't take my name in vain. And then commandment number 4 about the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you will labor, do all your work. The 7th day is a Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day. So in the 10 Commandments, God says, this is how I want you to structure a literal 7-day week. Why? Because I made the earth in a literal 7-day week. That's how I read Exodus 20.
and it's just because that's what's best.
God said, I want you to keep the Sabbath holy, the 7th day in a natural 7-day week, because I rested on the 7th day. And the implication being in a natural 7-day week. Right? So Genesis 1, you can fiddle around with Genesis 1 all you want and call it poetry. But in Exodus 20, in the 10 Commandments, God connects his 7-day creation with a 7-day work week.
Yeah, but what about gravity moving slower and the earth going slower around the sun? So the days were longer. The days were like a whole year instead of 24 hours. What about that? Boom. Your argument is done.
I'm cooked.
Done,
You
young
got
earth.
me. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I wonder why. I guess it's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like we just did the atonement episode. So I'm kind of seeing some connection between like Jesus saying, do this in remembrance of me. And then the Sabbath day, it's almost like a remembrance of what God's done. Like it's an acknowledgement of him that we're all here because he established it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's why he's like, hey, just mimic exactly what I did.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. Is that is the rhythm of, and then there's all these nested kind of rhythms of 7 of the Jubilee year, or the year of release, and then the 7th year of release is the Jubilee year, and then so there's all these patterns of 7 that are nested within each other that are exactly that, the remembrance of God's not only creating but saving and redeeming work.
It seems like it has to do with lordship, where there's order and establishment. There is a king. Like a kingdom is going to have some order to it.
Okay, and that is so interesting that is Jesus's comment of the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Was the Sabbath made for man, or man for the Sabbath? The Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. And he tied it to lordship too, that man was meant to rule over the Sabbath and enjoy it as part of his ordered kingdom, and not for it to boss him around, and that Jesus, as his place on the throne, is the Lord of that day, to rule over that day of rest and rejoicing.
Bro, it gives me imagery of the age to come, of like just the most perfect day. Like, think about you're 10 years old running through the woods with your buds. It's just a perfect day.
Unfortunately, the perfect day for me would have been playing Nintendo 64 or something.
That too, but then you go inside. We used to just always play in the creek with our imagination, and it was like it's a whole nother world, It
is literally
anyway.
A whole world.
So let's continue through this. Let's see what he says. Let's see what John Lennox says. And I love John Lennox. I'm not trying to. I take the same approach. I think where I'm like, yeah, you don't necessarily have to.
You know what? I actually do.
You don't have to get mad about this. You don't have to fight.
I actually agree with him. I would just come at it from the other side. I would say, like, where he said, you can believe in a young earth if you want to.
Oh, yeah.
I would come at it from the other side. Like, you can believe in an old earth if you want to. Like, you can let the scientists in white lab coats push you around and mock you and submit to that if you want to. Or you can be right and believe the Bible.
Yeah. I think Lennox's heart is like trying to kind of reach into the establishment and the scientific establishment, and kind of give people a way to faith in Jesus, even within that realm of like, hey, like, make it accessible.
Yeah. You remember, I don't know if you saw any of this stuff when Alex O'Connor had that interview with Cliff and his son.
Yes.
We actually reviewed it, and he was kind of soft. I wouldn't say soft on it, but when he asked him about the conquest of Canaan, and he said,
right,
like, I hate it too. I don't understand it too. I totally get it as like this act of generosity to reach across the aisle. And I see that here too, as an act of generosity to reach across the aisle. But then I did see, it took a while for it to kind of come out, but I did see some people push back and say, like, you don't have to apologize for that. If you're going to stand on the text firmly with a biblical worldview, you do not have to bend over backwards to apologize for God doing that.
What was the conclusion with that? That it was just like a just act because of their wickedness, or what was the conclusion?
Cliff kind of gave two responses, which are the two traditional ones, which is it was totally appropriate for God to do that, and number two, it probably wasn't as bad as the text. You are misinterpreting the text as saying, all of them. Okay, it probably wasn't all of them, because it says, make sure none of them are left, and don't marry them.
Okay,
so,
and I remember our angle, because part of the preservation of the gospel message, making it throughout all of history, was that Israel doesn't commingle with basically demonic ideas. Mm-hmm. And so there's like kind of twofold ideas, is that some of these people groups had Nephilim, and this is like the real fringe one, but like that they had some type of connection to Nephilim blood or whatever.
And so,
but then there's another thing where it's like they were just learned in the dark arts, basically. Like they did witchcraft and knew all these things about how to connect to the evil divine, the antichrist divine, rather than follow the God of Israel. And it was like, if you let that information corrupt Israel, you kind of lose Jesus, coming out.
And so if you're going to approach the conquest with a worldly mind already fully pre-uploaded, that is going to immediately rebuff you, those kinds of stories. But the point that those videos were making were, if you will firmly root yourself in the text, the conquest of Canaan makes it comes out of a biblical worldview, and you don't have to apologize for it. And I think the same is true for the age of the earth. If you come up against the text, you open it to page 1. God, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth, and he did it in 7 days, and he did it in this particular order. If you come with it pre-uploaded with a worldly mindset from, your high school science books, then it is going to immediately bounce off of you. But if you are going to firmly root yourself in the Bible, I don't know necessarily that you have to go with Bishop Ussher and 6,000 years old, but not millions. Definitely not millions. In the tens of thousands, probably. Somewhere in the 6,000 to tens of thousands range, but probably not even 100,000. But it takes you standing firmly on that book and saying, it's like the Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do no other. This is what this book says. Yeah. It's what it plainly says, is that these things are true. But what's cool is there are some really, really, really great people doing good work now to take the view of the Bible and project it back out and say, no, the view of the Bible does make good sense of the scientific data that we find in the field.
It's just the narrative you put over it.
Right. And this is, there's a great movie. It's a documentary, really, but it's called Is Genesis History? And the title of the movie is brilliant because the point that they're making at the title and directly from the outset is everybody has the same facts. Everybody has the same Grand Canyon with the same rock layers. Everybody has the same fossils. Everybody should be able to admit T-Rexes did exist. They're down there. Their bones are in the earth. Hello. Everybody's got the same information.
But did they have feathers?
Probably not. The question of when you dig up a bone, what does that bone tell you? It tells you that something died. And that's it. That's all that it tells you. That's all that science can tell you. The question of what happened to this creature, how did it get down there, is not a question of science. Science can never tell you what happened to that creature, other than it died and now it's under dirt. That question can only be answered by a question of history. Evolution is a story that people have, it is a theory. It is a narrative that people have imposed over history. And you have to, and then the proof, the burden of proof is on you to prove it as history. Not necessarily even to prove it as science, but to prove it as history. And you cannot do it. You cannot do it. Then on the flip side, there is the Bible, which presents itself as a history. This is what happened when the earth was made. And the burden of proof then is to say, okay, which of these stories about history is true? You have the same set of facts. We have the same Grand Canyon. We have the same fossils. We have the same DNA genome that we can look at. Everybody's got the same facts. Now, which of these stories about history fits those facts better? And I think quite plainly that if you will look at it with an honest heart, the Bible story fits the facts better of what we actually see in the field and in science. A lot better.
Man, that was a really good way of explaining it. How about we look at the way Lennox explains it?
All right, yep.
And then you can kind of maybe talk about why you disagree and why you disagree in such a strong way. Or maybe ways that you do agree.
Yeah.
Where you're like, hey, if you take that approach, that's fine.
Yeah.
Now let me try and establish that briefly. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then you have a
what you were
sequence
saying.
of days. Remember that? 6 days and a day of rest. Now, here's the interesting thing. In the Hebrew language, the first statement in the beginning were the heavens and the earth was this and that, is made in one Hebrew past tense. The tense changes to another past tense for the description of the days. You can establish that. I asked, to be fair, the professor of Hebrew at Oxford and the professor at Cambridge, and they agreed, amazingly, that this is what it says. Now, what does that mean? Well, Professor Jack Collins, who was a scientist and is now the chief translator for the English Standard Version of the Bible, which you may be aware of, says, I quote, "It means that the first statement occurs at an indefinite period before the second." What does the Bible say about the age of the universe and the earth? Absolutely nothing. So why fight about it, folks? Why? I meet people...
What do you have to say to that? Because that's kind of the workaround, right? That
I would say, sure, that's one way to describe Genesis verse 1 and Genesis verse 2. I have heard Tim Mackey describe it in a different way, where, so we'd say it like this, maybe a broader way to connect those two umbrellas, ways of reading it. Verse 1 and verse 2 are disconnected in time. Now, you can describe that in two ways. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and then some indefinite period of time later, the earth was formless and void. What happened in that period? Could have been millions of years. That's called the gap theory. If anybody wants to look into it, I wouldn't suggest it. It's not super plausible, but it's there, and people believe it, and that's fine, and that seems to be kind of the road he's heading down. Another way of looking at it is, verse 1 would be like the heading on a paragraph. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And here's what happened when that happened. The earth was formless and void. So they are disconnected in time, but not because verse 2 follows sequentially from verse 1, an indefinite period of time later, but that verse 2 follows logically, but not sequentially from verse 2. From verse 1. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
God created the heavens and the earth. Now let me tell you the story of, and to the end is how God created the heavens and the earth. They are disconnected in time, but not even necessarily sequentially.
Yeah, because it does seem like there is some aspects to it that are kind of retellings, where it's like, we created man and woman in our image, and then it goes, and then I took dirt from the earth and created man, and then Adam and Eve came later. And so it's like, okay, what day were they created, and what account is it? Or even, the lights, a light to separate the day from the night.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like he puts the moon and the sun into the sky,
right,
as well. Kind of seeming like they're the same thing, but not really at the same time. Kind of like there's this, like, okay, lay out the playing field and then tell a story about it. Lay out the playing field,
right,
tell a story about it.
Right, exactly. So I don't disagree with what he said. I just think, like, okay, that, yeah, people have read into it the gap theory, that they are disconnected in time but sequential. And I would say they're disconnected in time but connected logically, not sequentially. And so, yes, verse 1 and verse 2, there is a gap between them, but the gap is one of logic, not of sequence or time. So,
like, it's like narrative and clarity.
It is narrative.
Okay.
Yes, it is a narrative break, not a sequential or time break.
Right.
So, sure. And again, like, if you want to believe in an old earth, you can. People have read Genesis 1 and old earth into Genesis 1, but the rest of the Bible you really got to grapple with, and the science, as strange as that may sound, for somebody coming fresh into this video to hear.
Yeah, because I think what happens is people go, oh, well, it's pretty scientifically established that there is fossils that are this amount of years old. And so those fossils came about in that gap theory time period between Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and that's how that took place. And then God made man. So it's not necessarily theistic evolution. It's these other things were created first.
Right.
But then you run into the problem of death before
Yep.
the decision in the garden to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then even the idea of like Adam naming the animals. Like, did God create some other animals and didn't give them names, and then
Yeah.
did some iterations of those, and those are the dinosaurs, and they didn't work out too well, and he hit them with a meteor, and then he brought some to Adam after he created. I don't know. It seems like there's a lot more hoops you have to run through, and that's where it goes into the conversation of like, okay, do we know for sure that the established idea in the scientific establishment is true?
Yeah. That is the question. Yeah. Am I going to bow to the white lab coats, to the scientific consensus? Do I have to concede that point? Right. And again, like, to go back to the conquest of Canaan comparison that we made, like, you have to concede the point. It was wrong for God to do that. Okay. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, that was wrong. No, that is actually precisely the point that I don't feel like I have to. Right? No, I don't feel like I have to concede millions and millions and millions of years somewhere because the white lab coats tell me. Like, no, actually, I don't necessarily think that. So, why don't I take the book and re-examine the facts of my world?
Walk me through that to the best of your ability. Walk me through that logically. How you looked at the facts in light of the scripture and then decided that this line of thinking, the young earth line of thinking, is more logical in your mind.
Right. Okay, so remember I said there were two really pillars of millions and millions and millions of years. One of them is you have to accept evolution. And in order for there to be evolution, you must find massive, massive, massive timescales. So you're already going into it thinking all these minor changes over millions of years. So there must be millions of years somewhere for me to find.
And just to clarify, that's just a theory. It doesn't necessarily work that way.
Again, like I said, it is a story that you are telling about history that no one was around to see or record.
Because we did a Stephen Meyer video a while back, and the whole idea was actually the opposite happens. Giving enough time, you have more errors in the DNA formation and the proteins connecting and all of that than if you were given a shorter amount of time. So given the more amount of time, there's more failure. You don't just get
there's this
code. You don't get computer code that's our DNA with random mutation over a long period of time.
There's this great video. I love it so much with James Tour. I think it's done by the Discovery Institute. And they ask him a question and he like talks and you can see him get more animated and more frustrated and more. And then it's like the video cuts to black and they ask him another question and he's like back to being composed. And but in one of those really animated states, it's just like impressed onto my mind is he goes like, in organic chemistry, time is not your friend. Mm-hmm. All of these compounds are constantly degrading and falling apart. Time is not your friend. You need to work as fast as possible. These elements don't just like stay together and wait around for the next part to bump into it and form the beautiful molecule that you need. He's like, we are racing against the clock in perfect conditions. In perfect laboratory conditions, we're racing against the clock to put these compounds together.
With a mind.
Yeah, he's like, it is extremely difficult. It requires massive intelligence and lots of years of study to be able to take these compounds and put them together like we do. And he goes, and we can't even, like, we can barely do it with all of our mind and with the pre-made compounds. You want me to expect to believe that this all happened randomly without any guidance, he's like, absolutely not. Nope, absolutely not. So I'm talking more about the grand scale of fossils and the earth. So that's one, is evolution. You need massive timescales to fit it in there. Number two, the assumption that you have to start out with, and this is an assumption, you have to take this into the lab with you before you ever begin. And it is this. I should pull up that verse from First Peter or Second Peter. So here it is from 2 Peter chapter 3. Scoffers will come in the last days. This is Peter warning his audience. Scoffers will come in the last days. So think about all the people scoffing at a literal 7-day creation.
Hey, they will say, eschatology episode, man.
They will say, ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. But they deliberately overlook this fact. The heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water. And by the means of these, the world was deluged with water and perished. So here's the argument that people make. Things have been going exactly the same as always since the world was created. And Peter says, not so fast. You forget. There was a massive flood where everything changed. So here's the scientific thing. I look at the Grand Canyon and I see the river snaking through the Grand Canyon. And I say, okay, if that river has been doing the same thing forever and ever, how long would that river flowing just like that take to carve out this canyon? You know, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years? How long would the wind blowing across Zion National Park of Utah take to wind erode all of these sandstone structures? Tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years? Doing the same thing it's always done all the time.
Right.
But Peter says, you deliberately forget there was a flood that changed everything.
Cataclysmic event.
And there is no better representation of this than at Mount St. Helens. Because, and what is so wild about this is that scientists, so Mount St. Helens erupted, I think in the 90s or early 2000s, massive volcano in, I think, Washington State, blew up, covered the whole thing with lava and ash and totally terraformed the surrounding region. And this was the crazy part, is that scientists came in and they performed their normal tests, and they found, and their tests came back from the lab and said, oh, all this stuff is millions of years old. But they knew as a matter of fact, we saw this volcano blow up. This stuff is barely a decade old. It's not millions of years old, it's barely a decade old. But you would have to know, again, the history. It is not a question of science. It is a question of history. And you would have to know the history of what happened before you go in to make the assumptions about what you think happened here, right?
Yeah.
A volcano blew up here. Okay, that changes everything about what I think I'm looking at. And in the same way, if you look at something like the Grand Canyon and you think, oh, this river flowing as it's always done since the beginning of creation, well, how long would it take to carve out this canyon? Millions of years? Okay, whatever. On the other hand, if you say, about 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, there was a ginormous flood that covered the entire earth with so many cubic miles of water flowing across the land masses that totally terraformed everything that we see. And when you look at our rock formations with that lens, that all these fossils in these rock layers were not laid down over millions and millions and millions of years, but over a couple hundred days of the flood, of massive plate tectonic shifts and tsunami waves crashing on the shore and covering things in rock and dirt. And this to me is, how does a fossil form?
What I learned in science class was over millions of years, the earth compacts it down, and then the fossil, the bones, get replaced by rock.
Yeah, exactly. However, let's say your goldfish, Nemo, dies in the ocean. What's going to happen to him?
He's going to get eaten.
That's right. He's going to go belly up, and he's going to float to the top, and then he's going to get eaten by something. And then his bones are going to either decompose or be taken away or something. In order to become a fossil, something has to be covered by dirt. It's actually pretty rare occurrence for a fossil to be created because you have to be completely submerged in dirt first for a fossil to even have a chance to occur. Because if a dead body just dies out there, it is never going to become a fossil. It has to be covered by dirt immediately, very quickly, a lot of dirt. In which case, you could believe that floods and volcanoes and landslides have been happening, and that's how every single fossil in the world was made. Or you could say one giant flood all at once created every single fossil that we ever saw. And it's like you look at the Grand Canyon, and you go like, wow, this is so crazy. Look at all these millions of years. But then you go, where's the evidence for the flood? Point to me to the evidence of the flood. And the answer is like, everything. It was a worldwide massive flood that covers the tops of the mountains. Everything is the evidence of the flood.
Yeah. I think as a kid, I always, thought of the flood as like, okay, you can hop in your speedboat and it just like, it fills up and then you're way above the mountains and you're just sitting on top of this calm water and then it just subsides down and you're good.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about something like that. We're talking about like a rushing river that's like, I don't know, 100 stories tall or however even bigger, as tall as the mountains, presumably, and rushing at intense speeds.
Yeah.
Just picking up tons and tons of sediment and ground.
Yeah. So the Bible says that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And you're like, okay,
That's not that long.
We live near the coast of Texas. We lived through Hurricane Harvey down here.
Yeah.
That was a lot of water. That was a lot of rain. You can only imagine. That was like, what, 4 or 5 days of rain?
Yeah.
You can only imagine if it was 40 days of that kind of rain. But
and
even...
is that everywhere?
See, but okay, again,
everywhere?
even then you'd be hard pressed to really imagine like, okay, but that much, raining for 40 days and 40 nights covered the tops of the mountains.
Right.
No, but the Bible says the fountains of the deep were opened up, which could mean, go with me here,
Geyser.
Well, what if it meant that is when our plate tectonics began moving, and that massive shift in our plate tectonics launched tsunami waves onto the surface. So in that scenario, it would be not just rain, but massive waves coming from the ocean over and over and over again.
Could that have
onto the
also
surface.
been the Tower of Babel, though, whenever the ethne were created? Whenever it's
Right.
split
I
up?
think you're talking about, there's a line in the text of Genesis where it talks about this guy was named this because in his day the nations were, or like the earth was divided or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it could either reference the earth literally divided, like the plate tectonics started shifting, or
The people groups.
the people groups at the Tower of Babel. Sure.
So let me ask you a few more specific questions, because a couple examples of something that would kind of seemingly be scientific popped in my head, which was, I can't remember what king or prophet it was, but there was something with the planets moving or something happening. And then there's that one, and then so do you want to touch on that one? Does that play into what you're talking about at all? Because and then I'm thinking pre-flood, how people lived longer. So you could assume that meant the conditions of the earth and the atmosphere and
were radically
different. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember like reading a book with my kids and learning from whatever, you just pick up information like this. But there were some fossils of pterodactyls and large birds that we found that would have never flown in our atmosphere. But if our atmosphere was something like twice as thick, then they could have flown. So the theory is, even if you take evolution or design, Why would a creature evolve to get this big where it would grow itself out of the ability to fly? You know what I mean? And not like a dodo bird or an ostrich, but this thing was clearly meant to fly.
Yeah.
You know? And so natural selection or design would not fit you for that. So then the conclusion, you know, of I think where I heard this was a secular scientist was like, yeah, the Earth's atmosphere must have been a lot more dense in the past.
That's crazy.
And catch this, though. Think about like oxygen doping. When you fit yourself with more oxygen,
Right.
if you doubled the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, it would be almost like you were oxygen doping just by breathing
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
So things like that, where and that's what Peter says. He calls it the world that was. There is a divide in all of history and ecology and everything that separates what was before the flood to what was after the flood. So
studying it without that idea that this cataclysmic event happened on Earth, it's kind of like you're missing the big picture there.
Yes, exactly. And that is why, and again, for anybody watching, I would strongly recommend the documentary Is Genesis History. Last time I checked, I think it was on Amazon Prime. It used to be on YouTube. It might still be on YouTube for free. Super fascinating. But that is their whole argument, is that evolution is a story that you tell about history. It is not science per se. You cannot repeatably test evolution because it happened supposedly across millions of years in the past. You can't go back in the past and test it or see it or videotape it or anything. It is a question of history, not science per se. You can't test it. That is the scientific method, is repeatable tests, and you can't do that. Yeah. So is the Genesis 1 to 11. It is a question of history. So the question is, which story about what happened in history is correct? That is the fundamental question. And if you go out looking for evidence of the flood, you will see it everywhere. The whole thing is absolutely screaming at you. The world was deluged in a massive worldwide flood.
And I think even like people that don't believe the Bible is actually inspired, there's several secular historians and people who believe in worldwide floods.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Through anthropology. I mean, I think guys like, what's that guy's name?
I know it's been popularized on Joe Rogan.
Yeah, I was going to say Graham Hancock.
Yeah.
Guys like him who believe in these cataclysmic events. And there are enough anthropologically.
Go back, let that back.
Totally. Tribes across the world, all over, all have a flood story, which all share similar elements of the earth was evil, the gods wanted to destroy the world, they chose one family, he and his family got on the boat, this guy and his family got on the boat, they brought a bunch of animals with them, they were saved through the flood. All over the world, in places that you would never, ever connect. I mean, it is like more common than it is not common to have this story deeply rooted in all these ancient cultures, up to modern day cultures. And you would think if all of these cultures share a common story, and it's not rooted in history at all,
Yeah.
And I think so people, even secular people like Graham Hancocks of the world, have caught on to that of like, there really is something here. And that same evidence of like the whole, if you will look for it, if you will just open your eyes to the possibility of a cataclysmic event, the entire geology of the world is screaming at you, a cataclysmic worldwide flood. And they do not necessarily interpret it as the flood of Noah, but they do interpret these cataclysmic worldwide events.
But what's happened is we have generation on generation now where the biggest place of influence was the schools. That is classic conditioning over and over of a narrative and storyline. And it makes you feel good. I mean, to have a narrative, it gives you identity. It allows you to feel like you have the world figured out a little bit. And I'd much rather, prefer having some type of narrative to none at all. And so it is comforting and it feels good to the ego to, be like, oh yeah, like we know exactly how all of these details actually what the narrative is that these details tell.
Yeah.
In science, and the science says this, and the science says that. You just brought up. We'll just bring it up. You're bringing up the RFK like hearings of talking about big pharma stuff, and how the whole argument that we've been hearing for the last 5 years is just like
the science is settled, when what you really mean is it is a worldview of scientism, and the worldview of scientism is the consensus of the educated, the people in the know, the people in the white lab coats.
Yeah.
The consensus that they have is, we'll just slap a big label on that.
That is interesting.
The science.
Because we don't actually believe that. That's why we have a democratic republic, because we don't believe that just because it's the popular view that it's the right view or it's true. Like with any particular thing, we don't believe that's just because lots of people agree upon one set of ideas or narrative of something.
And you want to go back and look at the greatest achievements in science. People, just the deep irony that people want to take the heliocentric model and be like, Galileo and Copernicus, like those guys really stuck it to the church, and they stood up to the religious dogma and questioned the religious dogma. And now, how the turntables. It's the scientific dogma that you are not allowed to question with your religion.
Right.
But that is the whole spirit of science, is to ask a good question and look into it. And that is the whole irony of scientism today, is that you are not allowed to ask questions or question the scientific dogma.
I think that's what Lennox is trying to kind of maybe push back on a little bit, is this idea that you can arrive at Jesus being God and him rising from the dead through a scientific lens. And I think that's perfectly true. Like, you can go, okay, I want to figure out if it is a logical conclusion,
right,
to put my faith in Jesus as the Messiah, as God, and I need to gather all of the evidence, whether for or against, and then see what the probability or the likelihood of that being the case is. I think that's how we went to a Sean McDowell talk one time, and that's kind of what he said. He's like, you don't know for sure. You don't have a certainty just in the facts alone.
Yeah.
But the followers of Jesus dying for the claim that they saw him raised from the dead, being put to death for that, gives you a very high 90 percentile likelihood that it was true.
Yeah. And again, back to the RFK hearings, is that's what they kept throwing at him, is like, do you believe this? Do you believe that? Do you believe this? Do you believe that? And he kept saying, like, all I want to do is look into it. I believe in good science, and good science means asking the question and looking into it. And you won't let me do it. That's what I'm here to do, is to ask the question and actually look into it to find out if it's worth believing.
But you can't ask those questions.
And that is the great irony right now.
It is almost like a religion. It's a cult.
Scientism is a religious dogma. True science is a tool for how to ask a question and how to come up with evidence to decide on an answer.
It's a very similar response as to when you push on that like one theological thing that someone holds on to very dearly, that they kind of idolize.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's like, no, you can't say this, fill in the blank, what theological, whether it's, I won't even list
people
them
get
out,
that way about young Earth, and
Yeah.
people get that way about old Earth, and people get that way about
God inside, outside of time.
people get that way about, predestination.
Eschatology.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, you can't even ask these questions. It's a fact.
Yeah. But the heart of a true Christian is open to and ready to receive all kinds of truth.
Yeah.
The heart of a true Christian is ready to ask the tough questions. And I love this verse from Thessalonians. It said, they decided to live in unrighteousness because they did not receive a love of the truth. And that sense of that's what it means to be a Christian, is to receive a love of the truth, to want truth more than anything. And those are Jesus's words to Pilate. I mean, it's all
Whatever it costs.
Yeah, and Jesus says, like, anyone who listens to truth belongs to me. They're my people. And Pilate is the perfect modern response.
Yeah.
What is truth?
And there's more ways than just engaging with the mind to arrive at truth. Like, it is an intellectual pursuit, but there's also an experiential pursuit.
Yeah.
That every one of us goes through, and an emotional and a moral and a relational pursuit where you have to kind of reconcile, like, does love exist? You know, is there actually right and wrong? All of these things.
Yeah.
I did pray that prayer when I was, 7, and it did come to pass. And, and I look at all of these accounts of my life, of these things happening. You got to take a culmination of all that and take that into account.
Yeah. I think, but this particular one, because I really am interested in science.
Yeah.
Because I really am scientifically minded and I'm good at it and I'm interested in it, frustrates me a lot because
you're saying young Earth is not anti-science.
It is not anti-science. Absolutely not. No. True. I mean, sure. Your Uncle Rick, who posts on Facebook sometimes about flat Earth and young Earth.
Seems a little wacky.
Totally. Don't put us on that bucket though.
Are you a flat earther or what?
No. Nope. I believe we went to the moon. I believe in a round Earth that revolves around the sun.
Oh no, I'm not taking you off the chopping block yet. No, I'm playing. Yeah.